Good afternoon. I'm Brad Burton. I'm a professor of geology here at Western, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rod Eggert. Rod Eggert is the Viola Vestal Coulter Foundation Chair in Mineral Economics at Colorado School of Mines, where he's taught since 1986. He is also Deputy Director of the Critical Materials Innovation Hub, a research consortium of national laboratories, universities, and companies established by the U.S. Department of Energy in 2013 to accelerate innovation in energy materials. His research and teaching focus on mineral economics and public policy. He chaired the U.S. National Research Council Committee that wrote the 2008 book, Minerals, Critical Minerals in the U.S. Economy. And he has testified on mineral issues to committees of the U.S. Senate, House of Representatives, the Canadian House of Commons, and the European Parliament, most recently in September of this year. Dr. Eggert holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Earth Science, so he's actually a geologist. From Dartmouth College, a master's degree in geochemistry and mineralogy from Penn State University, and a PhD in mineral economics, also from Penn State. His presentation is entitled The Role of Critical Materials in the Energy Evolution. And I will be monitoring questions on the Slido app. If you have questions for Dr. Eggert, please join me in welcoming. So just aside.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to participate today in this very interesting meeting. And thank you in particular for including critical materials on the agenda. And I say that because I'm pretty sure 10 years ago, this topic would not be on the agenda of a one-day energy meeting. I'm pretty sure it would not have been on the agenda if this meeting were organized 3 or 4 years ago. But it is. And what happened? Well, this is what I want to talk about. It is a specific example of supply chain risks. And so what has happened is that we've all become aware of supply chain risks, broadly speaking, as a result of the disruptions during the COVID pandemic, and as a result of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. But what I want to talk about is slightly narrower in focus, and that is the potential for supply chain risks disrupting the energy transition. So hence the role of critical materials in the energy evolution. And I've organized my presentation around 3 questions. So if you get lost, just ask yourself, which of these 3 questions is the answering at the moment? And I hope it will be clear. So question 1, what makes a mineral or material critical? Question 2, what minerals and materials might be critical for the energy transitions? And third, what to do? Now, before we get to those questions, let's begin to ease into the topic of minerals and materials for the energy transitions with 2 recent headlines. So here's something from the Financial Times about 10 days ago. What's it say? BlackRock, and don't worry about who BlackRock is. BlackRock warns investor disdain for mining threatens the green transition. And then the tagline or the subheading, world's biggest asset manager hits out at complacency over supply of transition metals. So the lack of investment, or the seeming lack of investment in the raw materials necessary for emerging energy technologies, is beginning to be a concern. So that's part of the story. Part of the story also is geopolitical. And so here's a headline from a month or 2 ago, also from the Financial Times. And it was what they call the big read. It's something they do on the weekend once a week. And the focus was how China cornered the market for clean tech. And to what extent is that true? Should we be concerned? And how can we think about that? So these are two of a much larger number of issues around this issue of critical materials for the energy evolution. So now, question one, what makes a mineral or material critical? Well, if you're like me, the first place you might go to look is a dictionary and remind ourselves what is the dictionary definition of critical? And you'd find a definition that looks something like this. Something that is critical is essential, it's indispensable, it's vital. And you might say, well, lots of things are vital for the energy transition. And you'd be right. To really focus our thinking about this particular issue, we need a more specialized definition. So it's not just a critical material is vital or indispensable, but rather it has two other qualities. It's difficult to substitute away from, and it's subject to supply chain risks, either in the short term or the long term. It's the combination of the three things: indispensability, difficult substitution, you really need it, and supply chain risk that together lead to something being designated critical. Now, critical minerals and materials are expressions that have been applied to many different situations. Companies have critical materials. Those are materials that are vital to the company profits. So company profits are at risk. We can think about critical materials from the perspective of national security. And one part of national security is military preparedness. So a different sort of critical mineral or material is the possibility of a disruption to a mineral or material essential for military preparedness. Or maybe we're concerned about a nation's manufacturing sector and potential disruptions to its raw material inputs. That could be the way of scoping or framing the discussion of critical minerals. What we're concerned about today is with the energy transitions, or rather more specifically, the risks to the energy transitions associated with raw materials. Will the lack of sufficient, affordable, sustainable, and responsibly produced raw materials threaten the transitions to a low carbon technology? Now, I should pause here because we talk about supply chain risks. Well, in the world of critical minerals and materials, there are two somewhat different types of risk that are often jumbled together and confused. One is short-term in nature. The source is the lack of diversity in existing supply chains that leads to the possibility of disruption and surprise to markets. That's a single source of failure issue. There was an article in the Financial Times sometime in the, I think that's where it was, maybe it was the Washington Post somewhere, that talked about the reliance of global medical syringe companies on a single manufacturing plant in one city that I think happened to be in China. Now, is the risk China, or is the risk the single manufacturing plant for a vital product? So that's the short-term risk, and part of the energy transition issues are short-term in nature. But I think more important, relatively speaking, when we're thinking about critical materials for the energy transitions, is long-term in nature. And it's not lack of diversity in supply chains, rather it's lack of production capacity that threatens technology deployment, threatens progress towards achieving a low carbon or zero net carbon economy. Now, you notice on the slide that I also have the expression of the right type, lack of production capacity of the right type. And I use that expression quite deliberately to a short form for 5 things that I mentioned a moment or so ago. So to me, production capacity of the right type refers to sufficient, affordable, secure, sustainable, and responsible. Sufficient to meet the requirements for technology deployment for wind, solar, EV, and so forth. Affordable, so that we're able and willing to pay for these products. Secure in the sense that they are, we're managing risks appropriately. Sustainable in the sense that the production takes place with proper environmental safeguards, and responsible in the sense that the production occurs in ways that appropriately consider and incorporate community perspectives in the way mineral and material production occurs. And that's, it's not just a mouthful. It doesn't make a good acronym, SASSR, but nevertheless, it reflects the complexity of the issue. Okay, so that was question one. What's a critical material? Indispensable, subject to supply chain risks, either in the short term or the long term. Question two, what materials are critical or potentially critical for the energy transition? So we're narrowing our focus a little bit. What's a variety of things? What's the transition to low carbon energy all about? Fundamentally, it's electrification. What material is essential, has been and will continue to be for all things related to electricity? It's copper. Now, I'm not enough of a scientist. I'm not a scientist to be able to explain in depth why that's true, but copper has special properties that make it the desired material for all things electrical. But it's not just copper and electricity and electrification. It's electronic materials, things like semiconductors, aspects of solar technologies, more mundane things like power electronics. We have here a number of elements. How many of you are chemistry majors? Do we have one? How many of you are to a chemistry course and remember the periodic table? This is a real test of your recollection of the periodic table of elements. So electronic materials rely on things like gallium, indium, selenium, germanium, tellurium, silver, tin. And I'm not looking at the slide. I think I got them all, but I don't promise that I did. But a wide variety of minor materials that have small existing markets that are opaque and have difficulty because of the opaqueness of the market of attracting investments. Magnets. Magnets for motors, the most efficient electric motors, require selected rare earth elements in particular. How many of you know about neodymium and praseodymium and dysprosium and terbium, all rare earth elements, lanthanide elements, that row of kind of miscellaneous things down at the bottom of the periodic table. In small quantities, they are essential for today's state-of-the-art magnets. Very small, very powerful. They're in all your smartphones in really tiny amounts. If you had a two marble-sized neodymium iron boron magnets, you'd have to be careful not to damage your finger if your finger got between the two of them. What about energy storage? There's a lot of talk, understandably and rightfully so, about batteries and energy storage. Well, probably a third of the periodic table in one way or another is or could be involved in batteries and energy storage. In lithium, obviously, the state-of-the-art batteries today are lithium-based, lithium ion and other. But we have things like nickel, cobalt, and manganese in a very important type of lithium-ion battery in the essential cathode material. Graphite, the essential anode material in many lithium-ion batteries. We have vanadium, which not so important or not important in lithium lithium ion batteries or lithium-based batteries, but could be essential and indispensable if there's widespread deployment of flow-based batteries, not in vehicles, but in grid scale electricity and energy storage. Sodium, there's a lot of excitement about replacing lithium with sodium for sodium ion and sodium-based batteries. They would be heavier than lithium ion, but they have some potential more attractive features, including greater safety than certain lithium ion-based technologies. Fuel cells, the hydrogen economy, a little farther out into the future, but when we think about fuel cells and electrolyzers, certain platinum group elements, and particularly platinum and iridium, very important, along with several of the rare earth elements. And then nuclear, a different set of materials, including cobalt, indium, gadolinium, hafnium, and dysprosium. Here is a recent Department of Energy assessment that goes beyond thinking about critical materials as just yes or no. My previous slide suggests that, well, yes, something is either critical or it's not. It's really more of a shades of gray world or a continuum. And so this is a figure that assesses probably 30 elements that go into materials on the basis of in two dimensions. On the horizontal axis, we have supply risk increasing from low to high as we go from left to right. And then importance to clean energy on the vertical axis, low at the bottom, high at the top. And so high importance, high supply chain risk are those things in the upper right-hand corner, the ones that are in red. But there are 16 different boxes representing a more nuanced look at what is critical. It's not so much yes or no as how much, how critical. And so it includes things like lithium and nickel at the very top, battery technologies, the existing lithium ion, nickel, manganese, cobalt battery technology. A large number of things just slightly lower in red that includes both magnet and battery materials. And then in yellow, what they call near critical materials, which include uranium for nuclear power and copper for all things electric. Now, this is a somewhat static, or it presents it as a static view of the world. It's important to develop or incorporate some dynamism into this topic. And so let's look at a couple of figures from the International Energy Agency from a study in 2021 that go along with a kind of a statement at the top. And so the statement at the top here is what? Demand for some materials will increase significantly as the energy transitions occur. And it's not all materials, but it's a selected set of materials listed to the right. And you're probably in the back, I'm pretty sure you can't read this in detail and you don't need to. The big ideas are obvious as long as you can see the broad forms or outline of the figure. So we have selected materials, and then we're asking the question with these horizontal bar charts, the material intensity of a particular technology. So at the top, we have transportation, a conventional car compared to a typical electric vehicle. And the units of account here are kilograms per vehicle. And the key point is an electric vehicle uses a lot more of these materials than a conventional vehicle. And it's roughly what? It's 30 for a conventional car and 200 or more for an electric vehicle. So that's 5, 6, 7 times more material of these types per vehicle. Think about electric power generation. That's the bottom. The units of account here are kilograms per megawatt. At the bottom, we have coal and natural gas. And then as we go up, we go to nuclear, solar, onshore wind, and offshore wind. Again, the details are not so important for today's purposes, but the idea is that our requirements for materials, it's not so much that our overall requirement for materials generally will increase, but the specific types of materials that we will demand will change, and change often is challenging. Go from one steady state to another. Okay. Next statement, it's about supply chains, not just mining. So here's another figure from that same study. Now we are looking at the combined market shares of the three largest producing countries. The countries are listed on the right. Don't worry about the details. On the left-hand side, we have the mining or the extraction stage. And so if we look at the top, we have oil and natural gas. Three largest producing countries represented in the bar chart. And what's that? Call it 40%. I'm not worried about the exact numbers. What's true for copper, all things electric, nickel, cobalt, and lithium batteries, and rare earths, magnets, and efficient motors? They have a larger, and in some cases, dramatically larger country concentration of production. And as a general rule, the greater the concentration of production, other things being equal, the greater the potential risk. Now let's look at the midstream, or what happens after the mining stage. And here we have at the top, now oil refining, natural gas or LNG for export, representing the midstream, what comes after mining. And then we have the same materials, the metals, copper for the battery materials, and lithium. And again, for these metals, much more geographically concentrated production than for the traditional energy production. And if you look even more closely, this is where the China story, I would say, begins in terms of the discussion of critical materials for energy. Okay, so that was my second question. Which materials are critical for the energy transitions? Third and final question, what to do? Now, this by itself could be the subject of a 1-hour lecture. I'm not going to spend an hour, but I want to try to provide a way of at least framing our thinking so that we're not thinking about what to do in a kind of an ad hoc, unsystematic way. And so I think it's useful to distinguish between short-term actions and options in the long term, consistent with what I talked about before: the short-term risk, lack of diversity, disruption and surprise; long-term, lack of capacity of the right type to meet the requirements of the energy transitions. And so in the short term, we're primarily talking about commercial options. It's really not a public policy issue as much as it is a commercial issue. And so what can companies do? Well, they can increase stockpiles and working inventories. But realize that if you only start accumulating your stockpiles once the disruption has occurred, you will further destabilize the market. Companies can also develop sourcing arrangements, strategic alliances, which carves out a portion of the market from them, separate from the rest of the market. Companies can vertically integrate, and we've seen a lot of this over the last several years in the automotive sector, where automobile companies that 5 years ago wouldn't have thought much at all about their raw material risks, entering into strategic arrangements with mining companies. Previously, they would have considered this simply a commercial risk that was borne by their direct suppliers. And in many cases, mining is 5, 6, 7, 10 stages back in terms of their supply chains. And then adopt off-the-shelf technologies. Well, what about the long term? And this is where both companies and governments have important roles to play. Now, fundamentally, And strategically, how do you deal with supply chain risks over the longer term? It's one or a combination of three things. Produce more by increasing and diversifying primary production, wasting less by increasing manufacturing efficiency and enhancing recycling and reuse, and using less by developing substitutes that don't require on the things that are at risk. And all of this involves capital investment and R&D activities with long payout periods where there is a significant amount of risk and uncertainty about what the outcome of the investment will be. Now, an aside, a statement, this is my personal opinion, I think it's backed up by the simple arithmetic. In a world of growing demand, recycling can only be a partial solution to our supply chain problems. Just think about lithium. How much lithium has been incorporated into batteries so far in EVs? Not much. When will that not much be available for recycling and reuse? A decade from now. What will happen between now and a decade from now? The total demand for lithium in EV batteries may go up as much as 10-fold. So in a world of growing demand, recycling materials from end-of-life products, while it will be important, and we should figure out how to do it, it by itself will not save the day. It'll be important, it'll be essential, but nevertheless, more mining will be needed. Well, how can we think about public policy? And I'm coming close to the end of my remarks, so let me quickly throw out some ideas, not make specific policy recommendations, but a way to think about public policy. First, the broad context. Philosophically, when we think about public policy, we're thinking about, well, what do we believe the role of government should be? And the two issues that have become front and center in policy discussions over the last several years has been, how do you feel about globalization? And how do you feel about industrial policy? What do I mean by globalization? Well, for my entire professional lifetime, or adult lifetime, whether or not I was a professional, this goes back to the 1970s, the philosophical starting point is we should be breaking down barriers to international trade so that each step in a supply chain is located at the location where costs are lowest. And by minimizing costs, customers benefit, and overall, we benefit as a society. What's industrial policy? It's a public policy that prioritizes specific sectors of the economy. And by and large, not entirely, there are many exceptions, most public policy in the industrialized rich world over the last 40 years have started with the proposition that public policy should generally be sector agnostic. Public policy to set up the system, the framework, laws, money and banking, in which private initiative can flourish. And then the private sector will allocate capital. Well, we've come to question that in a dramatic way over the last 3 or 4 years. If we think about the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, this is the most massive example of US industrial policy in 50 years. A diagram where I try to, if a diagram is more compelling to you than words, this is my attempt to illustrate it. We have the pendulum is swinging from left to right. Globalization, a priority given, a philosophical priority given to globalization, and let the market decide, swinging to giving greater priority to regionalization and industrial policy. What's the narrower context of public policy towards minerals and materials? Well, I would suggest that we need to do two things simultaneously. In other words, hold two somewhat different thoughts in mind at the same time. One is determine how to responsibly and sustainably increase domestic production, while at the same time figuring out how to effectively enhance collaborations with strategic and I should say international partners. And we need to do both. We're not going to be self-sufficient in critical minerals and materials, and we shouldn't strive to be, because for certain things, it's cheaper to source it from outside the United States. A couple of the categories in which we might want to have a discussion about public policy are identified in a recent report that came out of the Aspen Institute, or prepared under the auspices of the Aspen Institute. I had a very small, and I mean very, very small, role in providing input to this. I'm not so concerned. I'm not going to emphasize the specific recommendations, but it has a number of categories of public policy that I think it's important that we think about. So if I think about responsibly and sustainably increasing domestic production, we need to think about permitting. We need to think about interactions with local communities and social justice, and in particular, this concept of free, prior, and conformed consent, in addition to some other things. We think internationally, it's activities like collaboration, standards, finance. To what degree should the US government be financing investments outside the United States? The Japanese did this in the 1960s and 70s. Korea did it in the 70s and 80s. The Chinese government is doing it significantly, has done it, and is doing it significantly in the 90s, 2000s, and up to the present. How do we feel about restrictions on international trade? And kind of a small specialist niche issue, and that is information. Well-informed private and public decision-making requires good information. For many of the critical material markets, as I mentioned before, markets are opaque. And so lack of efficiency, including lack of investment, is just, I don't know, what should I invest in? If I'm not active in the sector, I'm not sure whether there's not enough information to make me feel comfortable enough about making an informed decision. Okay, so wrapping up, return to the three questions. What's a critical mineral or material? Essential, difficult to substitute, subject to supply chain risks. Something important is at risk, and this important distinction between lack of diversity as the risk in the short term, lack of capacity of the right type being the risk in the long term. What materials are critical for the emerging energy technologies? Lots of things. That's less interesting to me than recognizing that the key risk is this longer term risk of lack of production capacity of the right type. Finally, what to do? That boils down largely to philosophy, and philosophy, what should the government do? What should the private sector do? And we need to, to me, it's not either or, but it's what combination. So we each have to wrestle with what is the right mix of market activities and industrial policy. Responsibly and sustainably increase domestic production, enhance interactions with strategic partners. And that's it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Eggert. A couple questions have come in from the audience, and like to start with one. There's a question: can research in materials science replace some of the need for mining critical minerals from a geologic supply?
Absolutely. And the way I think of this is in terms of the three fundamental approaches to. Are we still getting echo, or is it just my hearing the echo? It's okay. Think about the three fundamental approaches for dealing with material criticality: produce more, waste less, use less. Material science is the key in that third approach. So if I think about a decade ago, rare earth prices skyrocketed. One particular rare earth element, dysprosium, became, I think, for about a year, 10 to 100 times more expensive. Dysprosium provides essential features in certain rare earth magnets, in motors. What did the material science community do? In the short term, it adopted off-the-shelf technology that more efficiently used dysprosium in the existing magnet structure. But over the longer term, and in the last decade, there's been an enormous amount of work in engineering around rare earths, or more particularly engineering around dysprosium and some of the other rare earths, by developing lower rare earth magnets, rare earth-free magnets, and designing engineered systems that maybe don't even need magnets at all, but are motors. So material science is very important.
Moving forward, both short-term and long-term, how can other countries evolve in the energy transition without relying on mineral resources from China, either in supply or in processing?
In the short term, even the medium term, for certain supply chains, we are going to have to rely on Chinese production. That's where existing capacity is, and it takes time to change the geography of production. But we need to begin now, not by, I would say, eliminating China, but diversifying supply chains where possible and appropriately and economically viably in the United States, but also in countries where we have and are likely to have more consistent, friendlier interactions. It's places like, but not exclusively, Canada, Australia, Japan, the European Union, but even many countries in South America and Africa, which are eager to attract investment to fill our desire for more diverse supply chains.
What do you think about the assertion that there aren't enough critical minerals worldwide to accommodate global electrification?
I think the proposition that certain elements are not geologically abundant enough to satisfy our demands is misleading. It's a red herring. It's a fallacy. There's no evidence that geologic constraints are the key barrier. It's rather things like technologies that can efficiently and sustainably extract and recover the material. It's things like legal systems and public policies and ways in which local communities and companies can engage with each other to determine whether and how resource extraction and production occur. And if I might just extend a little bit, to succinctly answer the question, it's not about geology. It's about technology. It's about laws and social institutions. It's about economics, prices and costs. I'll stop there and let you get to other questions rather than just rambling on.
This may not be your field of specialization, but what can you say about the regulatory environment and new mining in America and in other Western countries?
I think in the United States, and to some degree in almost all other countries around the world, we are struggling with how to make decisions about resource development in ways that are timely, but yet appropriately consider environmental concerns, local community concerns, and there's not a simple answer. I think there's a tendency to think that the regulatory and related burdens in the United States are much more burdensome here than elsewhere. May be true, but to some degree, this is true or is becoming truer almost everywhere in the world. And I don't know what the answer is, except it's complex. We're going to have to try different things, experiment, but with an overall goal of I would use the following expression that it runs the risk of being trite, but how to get to yes or no quicker. I mean, no is an okay outcome of a process to determine whether resource development could occur, but it's not just yes or no or whether, it's also how. How can resource development occur in ways that are consistent with appropriate environmental protections and interactions with involvement of local communities.
Are you optimistic that critical materials mining will return to the United States?
I guess I always resist answering a yes or no question. And I would say yes and no. I am optimistic that over the longer term, the world will figure out how to satisfy its critical material needs in the ways I described. Some of that will be in the United States. Where my biggest concern is more in the medium term. And I didn't talk about short term, medium term, and long term in my talk because I wanted to keep it simpler. But to me, the short term is now up to about the next 5 years. And that's really lack of diversity is the issue there. In the long term, 50 years from now, we'll eventually figure it out. I'm confident of both technologically and in terms of institutions and public policy. But there's an intermediate period, say 5 to 20 years from now, where I think we run the biggest risks.
I have a question about informing the public and including students and members of the Western community on this subject. We often hear sort of an assumption that the technology is there. Let's just make the transition. And some of what you have presented here is showing that the mineral supply may be insufficient to execute that fully. What are your thoughts on disseminating that information, that knowledge and view to the broader community?
I think we need to go beyond lecturing. So you wouldn't want to have multiple days of me just standing up here talking about this. Rather, we need to have a discussion about what our goals are, how high a priority is expanding EV deployment, what do EVs need, and how are we going to make that happen? And it needs to be through an interactive process. I'm not a process person. I'm more of a just give me the facts, ma'am, person. But as the keynote speaker this morning, Kayla Dolan, said, process is important in involvement and engagement, and not just telling people what they need to know.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Dr. Eggert for his presentation and presence here today. Thank you.